20 dragons entered the Dance of the Dragons. None survived what came after. The most powerful creatures in the known world, animals that could melt castle gates, that had carried a single family to dominion over an entire continent, were wiped out not by any ancient enemy, not by ice or plague or the slow erosion of centuries, but by a family argument. One man's final, possibly misheard whisper started a fire that ended an age. Close your eyes. Let the air around you settle and feel the weight of the evening pressing gently into your shoulders. Allow your breath to find its own slow rhythm, the way breath does when nothing is demanding anything of it. There is no urgency here. The night is long, and the stories it carries are longer still, reaching back through centuries of blood and fire and quiet grief, to a time when dragons still moved through the skies of Westeros like slow, living thunderclouds. Tonight we are going back to the beginning of an ending, to the court of King Viserys I of his name, first of the Targaryens to hold his throne unchallenged for 26 years, first of the great peaceful kings of a dynasty that had built its peace on the bones of conquest. It is worth letting that image settle before we move any further. A king so loved, so magnanimous in his reign, that his very gentleness became the wound through which the world would bleed. You are not in any hurry tonight. The stories of the Dance of the Dragons will be here, patient as old stone, and they will unfold at the pace of breath rather than urgency. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands go still. The history will wait for you. Viserys I came to the throne in the year 93 after Aegon's conquest, a man of extraordinary personal warmth whose greatest love was not war, nor politics, nor the grand theatre of power, but the building of small clay models of old Valyria in the private rooms of the Red Keep. There is something quietly devastating about that image. The most powerful man in the known world, sitting alone at a work table, fitting tiny towers together with his own careful hands, trying to reconstruct a civilization that had already been ash for 1.5 centuries. As though, if he arranged the pieces perfectly enough, something lost might return. As though miniatures of a dead world could somehow stand in for the real thing. His reign was built on the same principle. Viserys inherited a kingdom still bruised by the chaos that had preceded his selection by the Great Council of 101, and he spent his 26 years doing what great peacemakers do, smoothing over the cracks, marrying the right people to the right houses, letting grievances dissolve in wine and festivity, rather than confronting them at the root. The realm loved him for it. Historians looking backward through the wreckage of what came after have sometimes wondered whether they should have. The land over which he ruled was magnificent. From the Neck to the Dornish Marches, from the sunset coasts of the Westerlands to the rain-heavy forests of the Stormlands, the 7 kingdoms lay at relative rest. The Iron Throne, that great knotted mass of swords, never comfortable, never quite finished, as though Aegon the Conqueror had left it deliberately unresolved, as a reminder that power is always provisional, sat in the keep that loomed above the place where the Blackwater rush met the sea, and scattered beneath the Dragonstone and within the dragon pit of King's Landing and across the volcanic rocks of the islands, the dragons dozed. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify. Link in the description. There were more dragons alive in the reign of Viserys I than at any point before or since in the history of House Targaryen. More than 20 by some counts, great ancient beasts and smaller ones still uncertain of their own heat. The largest of them was Vagar, who had hatched during the age of Aegon the Conqueror himself, and was now so immense that horses refused to be stabled within half a mile of her. She had been ridden by Visenya Targaryen during the original conquest, had outlived her rider by more than 100 years, and now rested in a cave above Dragonstone with the patience that only very old things ever learn to possess. These dragons were not merely animals. In the theology and politics of the Targaryens, they were proof of divine mandate, the fire made flesh that justified the family's claim to rule above all others. As long as the dragons existed, House Targaryen was unassailable. But here is what Viserys allowed to fester beneath all that warmth and peace, the question of succession. His first wife, Aemma Arryn, died in childbed in the year 105 after the conquest, and the child she died delivering, a son Balon, survived her by only a single day. Viserys had already named his daughter Rhaenyra, then a girl of 8 years, as his heir and princess of Dragonstone. This was, in the world of Westeros, an unprecedented act. No woman had ever sat the Iron Throne. The Great Council of 101 had explicitly ruled against female succession when settling the crown after Jaehaerys the Conciliator. And yet Viserys, perhaps from grief, perhaps from genuine conviction, perhaps from the slow, steady courage of a man who truly loved his daughter, named her the heir anyway. It is worth sitting with that decision for a moment, really sitting with it, feeling the full weight of what it meant. A father looking at his child, deciding that she was more worthy of the future than any man waiting in the wings. And then, 2 years later, marrying Alicent Hightower, the daughter of his hand, a woman chosen partly for political advantage and partly for the way she read to him, in the evenings when his eyes were tired, and having with her a son, and then more sons, and then watching, across the rest of his long and peaceful reign, as the court slowly and inexorably divided into 2 camps, those who believed in Rhaenyra and those who believed the new sons should inherit, as every precedent in the history of the realm said they should. He never resolved it. That is the most important sentence in the story of his reign. He never resolved it. He simply continued to insist, whenever asked directly, that Rhaenyra was his heir. And he continued to smile and feast and build his little models. And the wound continued to widen beneath the skin of the realm, year after year, accumulating scar tissue in the form of whispered grudges and carefully maintained alliances, and the very specific kind of resentment that grows between people who live in the same house and cannot speak honestly about the thing that divides them. The court that formed around this wound was extraordinary in its beauty and its poison. On one side, the Blacks, those who supported Rhaenyra, named for the colour of Targaryen formal dress, and the particular black and red that Rhaenyra wore after her stepmother appeared at court in Targaryen green. Green being, as every careful observer noted immediately, the colour the Hightowers burned when they wished to call their bannermen to war. Rhaenyra herself was her father's daughter in more ways than one. She was clever and proud, and possessed of the she-dragon Syrax, a golden beast of considerable size, whom she had ridden since childhood, and their bond had deepened over the decades into something that went beyond the relationship between a rider and a mount. On the other side, the Greens, those who supported Queen Alicent's son Aegon and his brothers Aemond and Daeron. Aemond One-Eye was, even as a young man, one of the most dangerous people in the realm. One-eyed since the night a childhood quarrel turned violent and cost him his left eye, and rider of Vagar herself, the ancient she-dragon who had been riderless since the death of Rhaenyra Velaryon. That a teenage boy with a grudge the size of a castle now commanded the largest living dragon, older than most of the great houses still standing, heavier than some of the lesser castles of the realm, was a detail that should have alarmed everyone who considered it carefully. Most people who considered it carefully did not say so aloud. Then Viserys began to die. Slowly, the way old kings sometimes do, the life drawing out of him over years rather than months. His body decayed faster than his mind, his fingers lost to some creeping sickness that no Maester could name or cure. By the final years he could barely walk. By the end, the bones of his face showed through skin grown translucent as old parchment, and he had taken to wearing a golden mask to public functions. The polished surface reflecting the torchlight back at observers with an unsettling brightness. He spent his last years in pain, and those who loved him watched, and those who did not love him waited. In the final afternoon of his life, Viserys made one last effort. He walked into the throne room with more energy than he had shown in months, pulled himself to his feet with a determination that observers found both heartbreaking and magnificent. And he sat with Rhaenyra for a long time at the high table. They spoke about old Aegon's conquest, about the prophecy that the Targaryens had always kept quiet and close, the one they called the Song of Ice and Fire, the vision of a long night to come, the belief that the dragons and their riders must stand ready against the darkness from the north. He had been trying, in his lucidity and his love, to share with her the weight of the dynasty's truest purpose. He was trying to tell her what it was really for. That night he died. Alicent was at his side. The things he murmured in his final hours were heard by her alone, and what she said he had said would change everything. A good man who could not make a hard choice left behind a world full of people who would make it for him, and make it badly. And the fire they started would burn for 2 full years, and take 20 dragons with it before it was done. The maesters who wrote about Viserys I in the decades after his death were almost unanimously kind to him. They called him a good man. They called him a loving father. They noted the peace of his reign, the prosperity, the absence of major wars. They were not wrong in any of these assessments, but a good man can leave a wound as easily as a cruel one, perhaps more easily, because a good man is harder to challenge, and the damage he leaves behind is often the kind that no one sees coming until it has already opened all the way. You can feel the shadow of this moment, if you let yourself, in the characters you already know from the main story set nearly 2 centuries later. When Ned Stark rode south to serve a king he loved but could not save, he was walking the same corridor of impossible loyalty that so many had walked before him in this earlier age. When Daenerys Targaryen stood before the gates of cities and felt the pull of a birthright that everyone simultaneously needed and feared, she was standing in the exact territory that Rhaenyra had occupied for decades. The heir whose legitimacy never quite solidified into certainty, who had to fight for every inch of what her father had promised her. The Dragon Queen of the main series was the great many times over descendant of the queen we are following now. The blood of this moment ran in her veins. You could see it in the set of her jaw. If you knew where to look, let that story rest now, gently, the way you might set down something heavy that you have been carrying too long. The reign of Viserys I is over. And what comes next is the part that history could not look away from. but you do not need to carry it forward tonight with any urgency. You are here, breathing slowly, the weight of your body settling deeper with each quiet minute. The story of the Dance of the Dragons has 9 more movements to run, and all of it will be here for you, patient as stone, slow as centuries. For now, let this first movement settle into you the way old knowledge settles, not as something memorized, but as something you simply know. And somewhere in a black castle above a volcanic sea, a woman with a dragon and a claim is about to learn that the world has changed while she slept. But consider this. While Rhaenyra mourned her father, the men who would deny her crown were already moving through the secret passages of the Red Keep. The king was not yet cold, and the conspiracy had already begun. Before Viserys' body had been prepared for the funeral rites, before the candles of mourning had been lit, 6 people gathered in a small room in the Red Keep and decided to overturn 20 years of a king's most publicly stated wish. The heir he had named before half the lords of Westeros was about to be set aside in a single night, behind closed doors, by people who had already decided that what they wanted mattered more than what he had promised. Let your breath find its rhythm again. Feel the weight of this particular night, not the night outside your window, but the night inside the story. A night in the year 129 after Aegon's conquest, when the Red Keep held the particular silence of a place that has been told to be quiet for reasons no one will fully explain. A king had died, and in the hours that should have belonged to grief, other things were happening instead. The chamber was small by the standards of the Red Keep, a room for private councils. Its walls hung with maps of the 7 kingdoms that Viserys had ordered updated just 2 years before, when he had still had the energy to care about such things. The maps showed a realm whole and intact. The people looking at those maps were about to ensure it would not remain so. Those present were Otto Hightower, the Hand of the King, and Alicent's father, a man of extraordinary political intelligence and the particular kind of flexible morality that political intelligence tends to produce in those who cultivate it long enough. Sir Criston Cole, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, once, by several accounts, something close to Rhaenyra's personal favourite and, by some accounts, her rejected suitor, though the truth of that particular history was buried under so many layers of loyalty and grievance that separating them had become impossible. Grand Maester Orwyle, whose presence at the table was both professionally required and personally terrifying, since a Grand Maester who witnesses a conspiracy has already become part of it whether he wishes to or not, and Lord Lyman Beesbury, Master of Coin, who would object so strenuously to what was being proposed that he would be dead before the meeting ended. Stabbed through the eye by Sir Criston Cole, some accounts say. Struck against the table in an argument that went too far, according to others. Simply overwhelmed by the shock of what he was hearing, in the version most charitable to those present. He was the first casualty of the Dance of the Dragons, dying in a meeting room before the war even had a name. The histories record that he had served 3 kings faithfully, that he was an honest man with an honest man's faith that honesty was sufficient, and that this faith did not protect him. The question before the council was simple, as the questions that change history tend to be. Viserys was dead. His named heir was Rhaenyra, Princess of Dragonstone, a woman with a dragon, and a claim backed by 20 years of public royal promise. What Queen Alicent now presented to the council was a different understanding of events, that Viserys, in his final hours, had expressed his wish for their son Aegon to be king, that she had heard it from his own lips, however faint those lips had become. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. Whether Alicent believed what she was saying is a question that historians have turned over for 2 centuries without resolution. It is possible she genuinely misheard a man who was half delirious with pain and grief, speaking about Aegon the Conqueror and the prophecy of the long night, and understood him to mean their own son. It is possible she knew exactly what she was doing, and had been building toward this moment for years, with her father's counsel and Criston Cole's swords, and the patient cultivation of every lord who had ever shown discomfort with the idea of a queen on the Iron Throne. It is possible, most likely of all, that the truth was somewhere in the complicated middle, that she believed what she wanted to believe, as all of us sometimes do, and acted on that belief with the full force of a woman who had been positioning herself for this moment for 20 years. Whatever the truth, the council voted. Lord Beesbury objected, and then Lord Beesbury was dead, and the vote continued without him. And in the grey hours before dawn, the decision was made. Aegon would be crowned. Rhaenyra would not be told until after the ceremony. The castle gates would be sealed, the harbour locked, and the city held in the quiet authority of a fait accompli, a thing done so thoroughly and so quickly that the opposing argument would have no time to organise itself before the crown was already on another head. Aegon himself had not spent the night of his father's death waiting at his father's bedside. He had been somewhere in the lower city, in whatever private diversions he preferred when no one was paying close attention, a detail that his supporters found inconvenient and his detractors found entirely predictable. He was not, by any honest accounting, a man who had been preparing himself to be king. He had understood since childhood that the succession was contested, and had apparently resolved this understanding by declining to take it seriously. When he was found and brought back and told what had been decided for him, his initial reaction was something closer to alarm than eagerness. It is worth sitting with that for a moment in the stillness of this late hour. The war that would kill tens of thousands of people, that would extinguish every dragon in the world, was set in motion partly by a man who did not want what was being given to him. He was crowned anyway, because the people giving it to him wanted it badly enough for both of them. That is not unusual in the history of inherited power. The people who start the fires are rarely the ones who burn in them. The ones who burn in them are the ones who happen to be standing nearby when the decision was made. The coronation happened at dawn, in the dragon pit, with the great dragon Sunfire, Aegon's own golden beast, scales that caught even the dim early light and refracted it into something almost beautiful, present as a living emblem of the dynasty's legitimacy. Sir Criston Cole placed the crown on Aegon's head. The assembled crowd, not the great lords, most of whom were not present, but enough soldiers and household servants and carefully chosen witnesses to constitute a ceremony, gave their approval. Ravens were sent to the lords of the realm, announcing that the new king was Aegon II. No raven was sent to Dragonstone, far to the east, on the volcanic island where the black castle rose from the rock above a cold grey sea. Rhaenyra received word of her father's death and her brother's coronation at nearly the same moment, because the maester who brought her both pieces of news had been placed in her household by someone who understood that simultaneous grief and outrage would be harder to think through clearly than either one alone. She had been pregnant. The shock of it sent her into early labour, and the child she bore in those hours was a daughter who did not survive. And so Rhaenyra, grieving her father and her child simultaneously, made the transition from princess to queen in the same long, terrible night. What she did in the days that followed speaks to the particular quality of her intelligence. She did not immediately mount Syrax and fly to King's Landing in rage, though the impulse must have been nearly overwhelming. Instead, she called her Black Council. Her husband Daemon, who was also her uncle and who possessed the dragon Caraxes, a lean red serpentine beast called the Bloodworm, whose appearance, neck too long, wings too membranous, body moving with the wrong kind of sinuous grace, had always made people uneasy in a way they could not quite articulate. Lord Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, the greatest naval lord in the realm, whose loyalty was cemented by blood and by long memory of being passed over for power by men he considered his inferiors. Daemon, it was said, wept when told that Viserys was dead. Those who had known him as a man of controlled intensity found this difficult to accommodate. He had been his brother's rival and his brother's shadow, and, in the strange compressed way of their family, his brother's truest companion. Whatever had passed between them across years of misunderstanding, Daemon exiled and recalled, loved and feared and never quite trusted. Grief found him where political calculation could not. He wept, and then he dried his eyes, and then he began to plan. Because Daemon Targaryen moved through grief, the way Caraxes moved through cloud cover, fast and without looking back. The letters that went out from Dragonstone in those first days were models of tone and precision. To the lords who had sworn to support Rhaenyra's claim, they were reminders of oaths made and the price of breaking them. To the lords who had not yet committed, they were invitations framed as opportunities. Be on the right side of history before history decides you weren't. To her sons, scattered in various postings across the realm, they were orders to come home. The Green Council's conspiracy echoes with uncomfortable clarity through every political betrayal the audiences of the main series came to know in later centuries. When Cersei Lannister sat in the small council chamber and bent that room to her will through a combination of intelligence and ruthlessness, she was Alicent Hightower's shadow cast forward through time. When Tywin Lannister counselled decisiveness and preemptive action, he was speaking the same language as Otto Hightower. The language of men who understand that legitimacy is not given but constructed, and that construction happens fastest in the hours when no one is watching. But there is one difference that matters. Tywin always knew what he was doing. Alicent perhaps did not fully. And there is a particular kind of tragedy in the damage done by people who believe themselves to be acting righteously. A villain who knows he is a villain can at least be argued with. A person who has convinced herself that her cruelty is justice cannot be reached by any argument at all. The Green Council believed it was saving the realm from an unprecedented and dangerous succession, and in believing it destroyed precisely the realm it thought it was saving. The speed with which Rhaenyra's supporters on Dragonstone organized in response to the Green Council's decision was, in retrospect, the first indication that the Greens had underestimated both her preparation and her support. The Black Council convened within days of Rhaenyra learning of Aegon's coronation, and what it produced was not the disorganized grief response that the Greens had perhaps hoped for, but a coordinated political and military strategy that had clearly been considered, at least in outline, in advance. Daemon had never fully believed the Green faction would honor Viserys' promise. He had been preparing, quietly, for the possibility that they would not. The lords who declared for Rhaenyra in those first weeks did so with a speed that surprised the Green Council's estimates. The Vale of Arryn, seat of House Arryn, declared for the Blacks. The North declared for the Blacks. Significant portions of the Riverlands declared for the Blacks. The Greens had the Reach, the most populous and agriculturally wealthy region in the Seven Kingdoms, and the bulk of the Crownlands, and the loyalty of Houses Lannister and Hightower. What they did not have was the sea. The Velaryon fleet, the largest in the realm, controlled the waters around Dragonstone and Driftmark, and sea control in the early medieval economy of Westeros was as decisive as it would be in any equivalent historical period. Let the tension of that night dissolve now. The council has spoken. The crown has been placed on a reluctant head. Ravens have gone out across the realm, and somewhere above a volcanic sea, a woman with a dragon and a claim has learned what was done to her while she grieved. The first movement of the dance has begun, not with a dragon's fire, but with a whisper in a small room, and a vote taken over a dead man's objection, and the body of an honest man cooling beside the table where he had served 3 kings faithfully and died for serving a 4th one honestly. The story continues, steady as a tide. They had called her the realm's delight once, a girl who had flown on dragonback before most lords' daughters had learned to walk. Now she was something else entirely, a queen without a capital, making a list of everyone who owed her a debt, and the list was longer than anyone had guessed. Before the war was 3 months old, the realm had fractured so completely that letters written from one region to another sometimes arrived without anyone knowing how to address the recipient, as subject of Queen Rhaenyra or subject of King Aegon. The maesters who carried those letters were forced to choose, in the most literal bureaucratic sense, which monarch they served. Their choice, multiplied across 10,000 such small decisions made by 10,000 ordinary people, was how a civil war became real. Not in the grand gesture of 2 armies meeting in a field, but in the accumulation of smaller allegiances, made in private, without ceremony, in the understanding that the choice made today would define the family's place in the world for a generation to come. Let yourself settle into the particular stillness of a realm holding its breath. Feel the quality of this moment, not the explosive violence that the word war immediately suggests, but the strange, suspended clarity that precedes it, when every lord in 7 kingdoms is examining his conscience and his ledgers and his obligations simultaneously, trying to decide which of 2 fire-wielding monarchs it would be more dangerous to cross. Take a breath. Let it move through you slowly. The decisions being made in great halls and counting rooms across Westeros in this season have already been made. The outcome is already history. You can afford to move through it without urgency. Rhaenyra Targaryen was, in the year 129, a woman of 33 years. She had spent more of her life as Princess of Dragonstone than she had spent as anything else, longer as heir apparent than many men spent serving in the positions they actually held. She knew the protocols of power with the certainty of someone drilled in them since childhood, who had observed her father's court from a position close enough to learn without being close enough to interfere. She knew how to write a letter that made a wavering lord feel seen. She knew how to sit in a council chamber and make men twice her age feel heard, even when she disagreed with every word they said. She was also a woman of genuine strategic intelligence, underestimated partly because of her sex and partly because of the rumors that had followed her son's parentage across the years. rumours that had done their slow, corrosive work on her reputation, like water finding its way through stone. The lords who might have followed her enthusiastically 10 years earlier now hedged their bets, sent politely non-committal ravens, waited to see which direction the wind would settle before committing their swords. This is the particular cruelty of reputation, in a world where reputation cannot be quickly corrected. A rumour planted in the right ear at the right moment can outlast any rebuttal, growing in the telling until it becomes its own kind of fact. Dragonstone was her base, and it was a formidable one. The castle had been shaped, in the generations before the conquest, by dragonfire wielded by the Targaryens as both tool and architectural instrument. Stone curved into forms that no ordinary mason's hand could produce, surfaces smoothed to a finish that was not quite stone anymore, corridors that seemed to breathe with the residual warmth of 100 years of dragons resting nearby. The sea around the island was cold and grey and perpetually in motion, and the isle itself rose from volcanic rock in a way that made the whole structure seem less like something built than something grown. The castle a natural extrusion of the darkness below. Rhaenyra was crowned there, in a ceremony that had the quality, as those who attended described it later, of a defiance performed as formal rite. A queen putting on her crown in the face of a world that was trying to tell her she had no right to it, surrounded by the people who believed otherwise, in a castle that had been her home since childhood, with the smell of salt and sulphur and the distant warmth of dragons in the air. Her own dragon Syrax circled the towers as the crown was placed on her head, the golden she-dragon visible against the overcast sky in long, lazy spirals. You choose your dragons, it is said, but the bond deepens through years of shared experience into something that resembles love more than ownership. Syrax and Rhaenyra had been together for more than 2 decades. The lords of the realm, receiving ravens from 2 different monarchs, had to make choices that would define their families for generations. Lord Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake, whose grey hair had not diminished his authority or his tactical genius, whose fleet was larger than the combined fleets of several other great houses, declared for the Blacks without hesitation. The Velaryons had blood ties to Rhaenyra through the marriage of his son Laenor, and Corlys had his own long memory of being passed over for the throne in favour of men he judged his inferiors in every meaningful respect. He brought the Velaryons, and with them the control of Blackwater Bay and the sea lanes that would prove decisive throughout the war. House Stark of Winterfell declared for Rhaenyra, as they had pledged to do when Viserys first named her heir. This is worth sitting with, really allowing yourself to feel the weight of it, quiet as it is. The same family whose honour and loyalty would define the central story of the main series 2 centuries later, was already, in this earlier age, making the same choice, standing by the promise they had made, even when keeping that promise became expensive. The Stark capacity for loyalty and to cost is not a recent development. It is a cultural inheritance so deep it has become something close to biological, passed down through the cold grey stone of the castle and the cold grey winters of the north until it is simply part of what a Stark is. The Lannisters, calculating as they have always been, initially sent polite ravens to both sides, and committed to neither, a position of studied neutrality that gave them the freedom to join whichever side appeared to be winning, which is the Lannister approach to most things when approached with sufficient patience. The Tyrells of Highgarden also hesitated. The Riverlords were divided, fracture lines running sometimes through the middle of single families rather than between them. The Baratheons of Storm's End made a choice that would have consequences, in circumstances that remain among the darkest moments of the entire conflict. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify. Link in the description. The dragons deserve a consideration of their own, because in this war, the dragons are not background. They are participants, political actors with wings and fire, their distribution between the two factions mattering almost as much as the distribution of armies. By the beginning of the dance, the two sides could count between them 17 dragons of varying size, age, and temperament. The blacks initially held the advantage in numbers. Syrax, the golden she-dragon, bonded to Rhaenyra herself. Caraxes, the bloodworm, ridden by Daemon, a red serpentine beast so unusual in its physical form that observers who saw it for the first time frequently checked their memory against their eyes, uncertain whether what they were looking at was really a dragon or something stranger. Meleys the Red Queen, ridden by Princess Rhaenys, wife of Corlys Velaryon, an older and deeply experienced dragon rider, and Meleys was a fast, agile beast with the particular intelligence of dragons who have been well ridden for many years. Against them, the Greens could count Sunfire the Golden, ridden by Aegon II himself, a dragon so beautiful in its appearance, scales that refracted sunlight into prismatic shifts of colour, that observers who saw it described an almost involuntary pleasure, as though beauty itself were a weapon, and Vhagar, the counterweight to all of the above combined. The oldest living dragon in the world, the only beast alive who had been present at the original conquest. So immense that her footprints, pressed into soft earth, were sometimes mistaken for geological features. Now ridden by Aemond One-Eye, who was 19 years old and wanted very much to use her. It is the imbalance within the green advantage, one enormous ancient dragon in the hands of a dangerous and angry young man, that gives the early strategic picture its particular tension. The blacks had more dragons, the greens had Vhagar. The war that resulted from this arithmetic was not fought between equals, which meant it was not resolved cleanly, and resolutions that come without clarity tend to leave behind consequences that take generations to work through. What neither side fully appreciated in those early calculations was how little the numbers would ultimately matter compared to the willingness of those involved to use their dragons against each other directly. Dragon fighting dragon, rider fighting rider. The thing that made the Targaryens powerful, the thing that justified their claim to rule, turned inward upon itself with such thoroughness that it would leave the world without dragons at all. The weapons of the dynasty became the means of the dynasty's undoing. There is a lesson in that, though it is not the kind of lesson anyone in the middle of it could afford to learn. The war in its early months was primarily a war of positioning. Lords were pressured, swayed, or bribed. Castle gates changed hands through political negotiation rather than siege. Rhaenyra's commanders moved through the Crown lands securing loyalties, while the Greens consolidated their hold on King's Landing and the Reach. Daemon, given command of what forces the blacks could muster, moved with his characteristic combination of recklessness and precision. He had always been a man who understood that speed is itself a form of strategy, that a decision made quickly, even imperfectly, was often more valuable than the perfect decision made too late. 2 queens, 2 thrones, 1 realm, and within it, every family that had wealth, or swords, or dragons, or simply a position on a hillside that controlled a road, every one of them looking at the letters on their table and making the calculation that would define them. The calculations were not purely honourable ones or deeds. They were not purely cynical ones either. They were the calculations of people trying to survive in a world where the ground had shifted, where the assumptions they had built their lives on had proven unreliable, where the future that had seemed settled was suddenly and entirely open. When Jon Snow was told the truth of his own blood, when he learned that everything he had been was not everything he was, the weight of what that meant, the impossible gravity of a legitimate claim he had not asked for and did not know how to hold, was the same weight that the lords of Westeros felt in the first months of the dance. What do you do when the succession is broken? When the person who should inherit cannot or will not, or is being denied what they were promised? The realm's answer, across its long history, has always been the same. It reaches for the sword, not because the sword is the best answer, but because the other answers require a kind of coordination and compromise that human beings have always found difficult to sustain at the scale of kingdoms. There is one more element of the initial alignment that deserves attention before the war moves into its active phase. The role of Harrenhal, the great ruined castle on the God's Eye that Aegon the Conqueror had made an example of during the original conquest. Daemon seized Harrenhal early in the war and used it as his operational base in the Riverlands, a choice that was both strategically sound and symbolically loaded, since Harrenhal had been a demonstration of what dragonfire could do to stone fortifications that thought themselves impregnable. Occupying it was a reminder, directed at every lord in the region, of what the war's real terms were. The Riverlands, caught between the great powers on all sides, suffered more from the war's opening movements than almost any other region. This is a consistent feature of Westerosi civil wars. The geographic centre absorbs the cost of the conflict between the political edges, the ordinary farmers and merchants and village dwellers bearing the burden of armies that march through their territory without particular concern for what they leave behind. The people of the Riverlands did not choose the dance, they endured it. Let the map of the realm settle in your mind for a moment. The great shape of the Seven Kingdoms, cold north and warm south, and sea on every side. It is a beautiful shape, held at the right distance. The beauty does not diminish what is about to happen to it, but it is still there, underneath the burning, and it will still be there when the burning is done. Your breath is slow, the night is deep, and the war is finding its feet. And then something happened that neither side had been prepared for. Something so deliberate and so cold that even those who had spent their lives in the shadow of Targaryen power found they had no precedent for it. The war stopped being a war about succession and became something else entirely. The first death that defines the character of the dance happened not on a battlefield, not in the air between two dragons, but in a corridor of the Red Keep, at a family's dinner table, in the particular darkness of a place where ordinary people live their ordinary lives inside the machinery of power. This is the detail that history cannot soften, cannot euphemize into something more palatable. In the fall of the year 129, two hired men walked through the rat tunnels beneath King's Landing and did something so precisely calibrated to cause maximum grief that it suggests an intelligence capable of weaponizing human love in ways that go beyond ordinary warfare. Let your breathing find its own pace tonight. There is nothing that requires your vigilance in this story. The choices were made long ago, the consequences have already unfolded, and you are here simply as a quiet witness, moving through events that are already over. Feel the weight of that stillness. The past cannot be changed. The grief cannot be reversed. and yet understanding it fully, sitting with it rather than hurrying past it, is its own form of honouring the complexity of what happened. But to understand what Daemon Targaryen ordered in the autumn of 129, we first need to understand what had been done to him, to Rhaenyra, to her children. Rhaenyra's second-born son by Velaryon was Lucerys, a boy of 15 years who rode the young dragon Arrax. In the opening weeks of the war, Rhaenyra sent her sons as envoys, young men on dragons flying to the great lords of the realm to secure oaths of loyalty in person, because a prince on dragonback arriving at your gate was a form of diplomatic argument that a raven could not replicate. Lucerys was sent to Storm's End, seat of the Baratheons, which was at that moment under siege by Aemon One-Eye. It was a bold assignment, perhaps an overly bold one, and the rider who arrived there just before him, already circling the castle on the back of Vhagar, was the person Lucerys had every reason to fear most in the world. His uncle Aemond, whose eye he had taken with a knife in a childhood brawl that had never been forgiven and had never been properly resolved. What happened above Storm's End that day is a matter of some dispute among the sources. Aemond had agreed, or had appeared to agree, to allow Lucerys to depart in peace. And then Vhagar, older, heavier, more powerful than any dragon alive, rose anyway, and what followed was brief and one-sided. Lucerys and Arrax were killed above the storm-racked waters of Shipbreaker Bay. Whether Aemond commanded it, or whether Vhagar acted on some instinct that her rider could not or did not override, the result was the same. A 15-year-old boy was gone, and the second of Rhaenyra's sons was dead, and the news of it reached Dragonstone like a hammer. The grief that Rhaenyra fell into after this was, by the accounts of those who witnessed it, genuine and total. The grief of a mother who had already lost one child during the chaos of the succession crisis, who was now losing her children one by one to a war that had been forced upon her. Those around her feared for her sanity. Those around Daemon saw a different reaction, a stillness, a withdrawal into silence, and then the quiet series of instructions that followed, given with the particular controlled calm of a man who had already decided what must be done and was simply arranging for it to happen. He hired 2 men, a man called Blood, a former guard of the City Watch who knew the Red Keep's layout and its secrets, a man called Cheese, a rat catcher who had spent years maintaining the tunnels beneath the castle and knew every hidden passage that the centuries of Targaryen occupation had produced. What he told them to do was simple. What they did was find Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen, Aegon II's wife, his sister by blood, a gentle and deeply strange woman who had spent most of her life saying things that no one understood until after they had happened, and force upon her the most terrible choice a parent can face. It is worth sitting with this for a long moment. Not with the violence of it, that is not what matters most here, but with the calculation behind it. Daemon Targaryen, a man of complex and often brutal pragmatism, made a choice in this moment that was not simply ruthless in the ordinary sense. It was the choice of a man who understood that grief is a weapon, that the specific grief of losing a child is a wound that does not close, and that inflicting this particular wound on Aegon II would make the Green King as irrational and unpredictable as Rhaenyra's own grief threatened to make her. A son for a son, not mercy, not war, something older and darker than either. Vengeance dressed as equivalence. Rhaenyra Targaryen, Aegon's queen, was never the same after that night. She had always been unusual. quiet in a way that suggested the world inside her head was more vivid and more significant than anything outside it, prone to utterances that seemed like nonsense, until, retrospectively, they resolved into terrible accuracy. After the night Blood and Cheese came to her rooms, she retreated into something that those who wrote about her later consistently described with the same word. Silence. Not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone who had gone away and left her body behind to manage without her. She eventually died by falling from a window of the Red Keep. Whether this was her own doing or something done to her, the histories do not agree. Her dragon, Dreamfire, felt it. Dragons feel the deaths of their riders, some deeply, some passing it with a kind of animal incomprehension, others with what observers have consistently described as grief. Dreamfire, they say, screamed. The aftermath of Blood and Cheese changed the character of the war in ways that were felt in every subsequent engagement. Before it, there had been a tacit understanding between the two factions that certain lines existed, that however ruthless the political maneuvering, however bloody the military confrontations, the inner circles of both dynasties were not simply exposed targets. After it, there was no such understanding. Every person connected to either side understood that they were now playing a game in which the rules had been suspended, in which the other side's grief was a resource to be harvested, in which children and wives and household members were potential assets in the war of psychological attrition. Aegon's rage after the death of his son was everything Daemon had probably calculated it would be. Enormous, destabilizing, directed not with strategic precision, but with the blunt force of a man in unbearable pain. He demanded vengeance at a scale and speed that his advisers could not accommodate, and his inability to act immediately on the scale he wanted made the rage curdle into something worse, a steady, settled hatred that would define his conduct for the rest of the war, and make him, in the final assessment of posterity, a king whose few genuine moments of courage were overwhelmed by the weight of his cruelty. The modern echo of Blood and Cheese is not found in a single moment of the main series. It is found in the structure of grief itself, the way it shapes characters we love into something unrecognizable. When Cersei Lannister lost her children one by one, the person she became was not the person she had been, and the choices she made from within that grief were choices that the original Cersei, calculating, controlled, genuinely intelligent, would have recognized as mistakes. When Daenerys burned King's Landing, the woman who committed that act was not the woman who had freed slaves in Essos with such genuine moral purpose. She was the accumulation of everyone she had lost, every grief unaddressed, every betrayal absorbed, the cost of it finally exceeding the capacity of anyone to hold. Grief is not an excuse. The histories of Westeros, across all the centuries they cover, are consistent on this point. Grief does not absolve the actions it produces, but grief is an explanation. And explanation and absolution are different things, and keeping them separate is the work of the kind of careful, empathetic reading of history that the Dance of the Dragons demands. Every person in this war was, at some point, acting from grief. Every atrocity has a grief before it, if you trace the chain back far enough. That does not make the atrocity smaller. It makes the chain longer. It makes the original rupture, the crisis of succession, the unresolved question, the good king who would not make a hard choice, matter more, not less. The war in the months after Blood and Cheese took on a quality that observers in both courts found difficult to name precisely. It was still, in its official rhetoric, a war about legitimate succession. It was still, in its practical conduct, a war of military positioning and strategic advantage. But underneath both of those layers was something else. A personal score between two families that had moved beyond the original question and was now feeding on itself, each act of cruelty generating the justification for the next one, the original cause receding further and further from the actual violence like a horizon that can never quite be reached. This is the dance that gives the war its name. Not the graceful, courtly dance of musicians and partners in formal step, but the older, stranger meaning, the circling of two things around each other in a pattern that has its own terrible momentum, each movement generating the next, neither one able to stop without being consumed by the other's inertia. Caraxes and Vhagar circling, Rhaenyra and Aegon circling, grief and rage circling. The war had found its real shape, and it was the shape of two people who had started as family and ended as the most dedicated enemies they had ever known. If you are still with us, and still awake enough to wonder, subscribe so the next chapter is waiting for you when you return. Sleep well. The intelligence that designed Blood and Cheese is worth considering for a moment, because it is the kind of intelligence that does not announce itself, and is therefore more disturbing than the kind that does. The ordinary cruelties of war, the burning of crops, the siege that starves a castle into submission, the battle that kills soldiers who were prepared to die, operate within a framework that all participants understand and, in some sense, consent to by their presence in the war. What Daemon arranged was different. It violated the implicit framework, reached past the combatants and into the domestic space of the enemy household, and inflicted a specifically personal and irreversible loss on a specific person for the explicit purpose of making that person less capable of effective leadership. This is a kind of strategic thinking that is both sophisticated and deeply ugly, and it is a measure of how completely the dance had already changed its participants that Daemon, a man with genuine capacities for honor and affection, who had wept at his brother's death, and who loved his daughters with evident sincerity, could arrive at it without, as far as the records show, significant internal hesitation. Wars do this to people. The dance did it faster than most. Let yourself breathe now, in and out. The darkness inside the story is real, but you are outside of it. You are here, in the quiet, in whatever corner of the world you inhabit tonight. The children of these kings and queens have been gone for nearly 2 centuries. Their grief has long since dissolved into the general grief of history, which is very large and very old, and does not require anything from you tonight. Let it rest. And in the resting, let your own thoughts go quiet too, the way thoughts do when you stop asking them to do anything. The Greens had found allies beyond the sea, powers that had their own reasons for wanting the Blacks weakened, their own debts to settle with House Velaryon. And they were coming by water, where dragons are not at their best, and ships are more than ships. There is a body of water between the island of Dragonstone and the mainland of Westeros that the sailors call the Gullet, a strait of several miles of cold grey chop, frequently obscured by sea mist, navigated by fishermen and traders and Velaryon warships as a matter of ordinary commerce. In the summer of 129, this unremarkable stretch of water became the site of the largest naval battle in the history of the Dance of the Dragons, and one of the most tactically complex engagements ever fought, when the combination of sea power and dragon power is taken into account. The night is quiet around you, let it be quiet. Let the sound of water in this story, cold and dark and deep, the gullet in early summer, fog still clinging to the surface in the hours before dawn, settle around you rather than agitate you. The battle that happened here was real, and it was terrible, and it is also over, and the water closed over it the way water closes over everything in the end. You are here for the understanding, not the urgency. The three daughters, Tyrosh, Lys and Myr, the powerful city-states of the narrow sea that had formed their alliance and called it the Triarchy, had been enemies of House Velaryon for years before the dance began. Corlys Velaryon had spent years fighting them over control of the Stepstones, the island chain that controlled the sea routes between Essos and Westeros. And the Triarchy had never forgiven the Sea Snake for the humiliations he had inflicted upon them during those campaigns. When the Greens approached them with an offer, "Join us, strike at Velaryon's fleet and his Dragonstone, divide the spoils of a black defeat between you," the Triarchy accepted. They assembled a fleet of 99 ships and sent it into the gullet in the dark hours before a summer dawn. What made this battle extraordinary was not simply its scale. Naval engagements of comparable size had been fought before in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. What made it extraordinary was the confluence of the naval force with the dragons, the specific challenge of matching fire-breathing aerial creatures against the particular geometry of a sea battle, where ships move slowly and cannot retreat quickly, and the water around them is both weapon and vulnerability simultaneously. 3 of the black dragons were involved. The eldest of Rhaenyra's sons still living, Jacaerys, rode Vermax, a young dragon, not yet fully grown, fast and eager in the way of young things not yet wise enough to be cautious. The dragon Seasmoke, pearl grey and quick, was at that time riderless, the dragon of Laenor Velaryon, who had died some years before the war began, and who had never quite accepted a new rider in the years since, circling Driftmark in a widening loneliness that some of the dragon keepers found difficult to witness. And Tyraxes, another of the young Velaryon dragons, ridden by Rhaenyra's third son. The battle that unfolded in the gullet that night was, and this is one of the genuine tactical paradoxes of dragonfire warfare, a battle that the black dragons could not simply win by burning everything in sight. Though fire-breathing creatures above a fleet of wooden ships would seem, at first glance, to be an overpowering advantage. The problem was the water. A ship on fire does not simply sink cleanly. It becomes a burning obstacle that adjacent ships must navigate around. A floating hazard of ash and tar and burning rigging that spreads fire to things it was not aimed at. And a dragon flying low over a naval engagement is itself a target. Ballistae, the great mounted crossbows that the Triarchy had deployed in significant numbers specifically to defend against aerial assault, fired bolts as long as a man is tall that could penetrate a dragon's wing membrane with terrible efficiency. Jacaerys died in the battle. The histories disagree on the specific manner, whether Vermax was struck by a ballista bolt and fell into the sea, whether Vermax's fire caught the rigging of a ship directly below, and the explosion of burning pitch carried both dragon and rider into the water, whether Jacaerys himself fell first, and Vermax followed in the desperate way that a dragon will sometimes follow its rider, even into fatal circumstances. The details are obscured. What is certain is that both of them went into the cold grey water of the gullet and did not come up. The third of Rhaenyra's sons was dead. It is worth pausing here, really pausing, not hurrying past this accumulation of losses, to contemplate what Rhaenyra's experience of this war was from a mother's perspective. She had begun it with 5 children of various ages, all of them alive. She had lost the daughter born in the crisis of her father's death and her brother's coronation. She had then lost Lucerys above Storm's End. She had now lost Jacaerys in the gullet. She was a queen fighting a war of legitimate succession, and the war was taking her children one by one with a systematic cruelty that felt, if you did not believe in the randomness of war, almost like design. The sea battle itself was costly for both sides. The Triarchy lost scores of ships and thousands of men. Dragonfire, whatever its limitations in naval combat, is still Dragonfire, and the remaining Valyrian-blooded riders and their dragons inflicted enormous damage on the fleet before the engagement ended. Corlys Velaryon's own commanders fought with the skill and desperation of men defending their home waters. The gullet was held in the sense that Dragonstone itself was not taken, and the primary naval approach to the Black Stronghold remained controlled by Velaryon ships. But the strategic cost was significant. The loss of Jacaerys was not only a personal tragedy for Rhaenyra, it was a military blow, because each dragon rider who died was a loss that could not be replaced at anything like the rate of ordinary soldiers. You could recruit 10,000 soldiers in a season. You could not grow a new dragon rider in any amount of time, because dragon riders were not made, but born, the old Valyrian bloodlines being the only lineage that consistently produced them. And the supply of Valyrian blood in the world outside House Targaryen and its closest kin was finite and diminishing. The sea closed over the gullet in the aftermath of the battle and resumed its ordinary grey-going. Ships burned and sank. Bodies floated and were eventually lost to the current. The Triarchy fleet withdrew, damaged but not destroyed, and the Greens continued their hold on the mainland, while the Blacks consolidated their position on the islands. The war had reached its first great test of naval power, and had produced no decisive conclusion, only more loss, more grief, more of the slow diminishment that was the Dance of the Dragon's truest and most lasting legacy. There is something in the texture of this battle that connects across the centuries to the military situation that faces Daenerys Targaryen when she brings her dragons to Westeros in the main series. The same calculus applies. A dragon is an overwhelming force in the open field, but it is not invincible, and the weapons used to bring down Jacaerys and Vermax in the gullet, the great crossbows, the concentrated fire, the willingness to accept extraordinary losses in exchange for a single successful strike at the aerial threat, are the ancestors of the scorpion weapons that prove so effective against Drogon in the battles of the main series. The Targaryens learned this lesson in the dance, at terrible cost, and then, because the dance ended the way it did, with the dragons gone and the dragon lore scattered, and the survivors too traumatized to write careful military manuals about what they had discovered, the lesson was lost again. 2 centuries later, Daenerys arrived in Westeros with 3 dragons, and a certainty about their invulnerability that was not supported by the actual history of their use in warfare, because the history of their use in warfare had been imperfectly preserved. The Targaryens have always been a family with a long memory for certain things, and a specific inability to pass down the warnings that matter most. The story of the dance is, in one reading, the story of what happens when a dynasty forgets the most important things its own history has to teach it. Rhaenyra received news of Jacaerys' death at Dragonstone, and what happened to her in those days is not well recorded, which is itself a kind of record, because the things that happen to people in their most private moments of grief are rarely the things that make it into the official histories. What we can infer from her subsequent actions is that she had not broken. She had not retreated. She had drawn whatever remained of herself around a centre that was by now very damaged, and she was continuing to function as a queen, making decisions and writing letters and planning the next moves of a war that kept taking things from her. The gullet closed over its dead and moved on, the way water does. The bodies of the ships dissolved slowly into the sediment of the strait's floor. The bones of men and the larger stranger bones of at least one dragon settled into the particular quietness of deep water. Nothing marks the spot now. The water looks the same as it did before, and the same as it has looked since. The specific catastrophe that happened in a specific moment has become simply part of the ongoing life of the sea, which is the fate of almost everything that seems, in the moment of its happening, irreversible and enormous. The story of the dragon seeds, the individuals of common Valyrian blood who would come to ride the riderless dragons of the dance, begins in the aftermath of the gullet. The death of Jacaerys made Vermax riderless, adding to the small and growing inventory of dragons who had outlived their riders, and now circled the coasts of Dragonstone and Driftmark without direction. Sea Smoke had been riderless since the death of Lenor Velaryon some years before the war began. Vermax was now riderless. And there were younger animals, barely old enough to be considered full dragons, who had never been properly bonded at all. The campaign to find new riders for these animals was one of the stranger episodes of the dance. Strange in the way that necessity always produces strange solutions. The conventional options having been exhausted, and the unconventional ones suddenly seeming, if not sensible, at least possible. Men and women of obscure Crownland's origin, who had lived their entire lives without any consciousness of carrying Valyrian blood, suddenly found themselves in the Dragonstones of Dragonstone, standing before ancient and enormous animals, trying to establish a bond that should by all rights have been impossible. Several of them died in the attempt. The nature of dragon bonding is not a gentle process when approached by someone who has not grown up in relationship with a dragon from youth. Those who succeeded changed the war, not decisively, not permanently, but enough to demonstrate that the resource pool of potential dragon riders was not as exhausted as the simple count of surviving Targaryen family members suggested. The Dance of the Dragons was, among other things, the moment when the specifically aristocratic nature of dragon riding began to break down, when the formal connection between noble Valyrian bloodlines and the capacity to bond with dragons became complicated by the evidence that the blood had spread further and thinner than the great houses had realized, distributing itself through 100 years of informal connection between the dragon lords and the ordinary people of their domains. Let the sound of that water carry you now, not the water of the battle, but whatever water exists in the soundscape of your imagination, slow and dark and without urgency. The gullet has been crossed. The war has found a new shape. And somewhere on the mainland, in a place called Rook's Rest, the next confrontation is already taking form. The confrontation that will test whether the Green's greatest advantage, Vargar the ancient and enormous, can be turned into a decisive weapon without destroying the person directing it. Aemond One-Eye had spent months burning the Riverlands unopposed, flying Vargar over villages and fields and leaving columns of smoke as his only annotation. No one had been able to stop him, and now someone was going to try. There is a castle on a cliffside on the Crownlands coast called Rook's Rest, not large, not particularly significant in the ordinary accounting of Westeros, not a seat of great power or ancient lineage, but positioned in a way that made it tactically important in the geography of the dance, sitting at a point on the coast where it could receive supply by sea and threaten the inland routes that the Greens needed to control. In the year 129, Sir Criston Cole led a Green army against it, and Rhaenys Targaryen, the queen who never was, rode melees to its defence. There is something profoundly right about the name history gave Rhaenys Targaryen, if you sit with it long enough. The queen who never was. A woman who had arguably the strongest claim to the throne at the time of Jaehaerys, the conciliator's succession, who was passed over by the Great Council in favour of her male cousin, who lived with that verdict for decades, without surrendering either her dignity or her judgment, who became one of the most respected figures in both the Black Council and the broader realm simply by continuing to be herself with enormous consistency across a very long life. She rode Meleys, whom they called the Red Queen, a she-dragon of middle age, faster than Vhagar and more agile, deep crimson in her scales with a crest of rose and pink that made her look, in full flight against a clear sky, like a living flame. Meleys and Rhaenys had been partners for decades. Their bond one of the most complete rider and dragon relationships in the history of the Targaryen dragons. You could see it in the way they flew together, not the slight mismatch of a new pairing still finding its language, but the seamless integration of two creatures who had long since stopped needing to negotiate. The battle at Rook's Rest was a trap. Aemond had anticipated that the Blacks would send dragons to defend any besieged castle, and he had arranged for precisely the contingency that arrived, Rhaenys on Meleys, flying to the relief of a castle that was already being flanked. He and his brother Aegon Sued were already in the air, Aegon on Sunfire the Golden, and Aemond on Vhagar, concealed somewhere in the clouds above the battlefield, waiting for Meleys to commit herself, before revealing that she was outnumbered 2-1 in the sky. What Rhaenys saw when Vhagar and Sunfire emerged from the clouds above her was the arithmetic of her situation laid plain. Vhagar alone was a match she could perhaps have survived. The ancient dragon was enormous and powerful, but Meleys was fast, and in a one-on-one engagement, the speed of the Red Queen was a genuine tactical factor. Against Vhagar and Sunfire together, the mathematics were different. The smart choice, the choice that tactical manuals, if Westeros had them, would have endorsed, was to retreat, to pull Meleys back to Dragonstone and preserve both dragon and rider for a future engagement in which the odds were less punishing. Rhaenys did not retreat. She dove at Aegon II and Sunfire with the full force and fury of Meleys in a killing dive, not away from the trap, but directly through the centre of it, targeting Sunfire rather than Vhagar, catching the golden dragon in a collision of fire and claw and the particular terrible physics of two large animals striking each other at speed. Sunfire was badly injured. Aegon the Stew was burned so severely that those who reached him on the ground believed initially that he was dead. The king, who had been crowned in a dawn ceremony in the dragon pit, lay in the mud of a crownlands hillside, with burns covering most of his body, his dragon crippled beside him, unconscious and likely to remain so for a long time. And then Vhagar closed on Meleys, and it was over. Rhaenys and her dragon did not survive. What remained of them was found afterward on the hillside below. Not much, as tends to be the case when Vhagar is involved. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of this late hour, to sit with what Rhaenys Targaryen chose in that moment. She did not have to stay. She could have turned Meleys around the instant she saw the size of the force aligned against her, and returned to Dragonstone to report that Rook's Rest had fallen, and that the Greens had deployed 2 dragons to defend their siege. This would have been the strategically sound decision. This would have preserved her life and Meleys' life, and the military assets they represented. She chose instead to make her death matter, to injure Aegon II so severely that he would be removed from the field of war for months or years, that the Greens would lose their most visible symbol of legitimate monarchy at the moment they were trying hardest to consolidate their position. She took the trade, her life and her dragon's life, for the crippling of the opposing king. Whether this was a calculated decision made in the seconds between recognizing the trap and committing to it, or whether it was something more instinctive, the final expression of a woman who had spent her entire life being denied the throne and had finally found a way to strike at the people who had denied it, is a question the histories cannot answer. Perhaps she could not have answered it herself. The immediate effect on the Green cause was significant. Aegon survived, barely, painfully, spending the following months in a state between life and death that left the actual direction of the Green War effort to his brother Aemond. Aemond One-Eye, 19 years old, in command of both Vhagar and the Green military apparatus, with a personal grudge against the Blacks that went back to the childhood night he lost his eye, was not a moderating influence. He had been dangerous when he was merely an exceptionally capable prince. Given actual authority, he became something else, a weapon looking for targets. He found them in the Riverlands, the campaign that Aemond conducted across the centre of Westeros in the months following Rook's Rest was not, in any honest assessment, a military campaign in the traditional sense. It was a demonstration. Vhagar deployed not as a tactical asset aimed at specific military objectives, but as a terror weapon, burning villages and crops and holdfast after holdfast in a systematic pattern designed to show the lords of the Riverlands what the cost of supporting Rhaenyra would be. The columns of smoke that rose from the Riverlands in that season could be seen from the walls of Harrenhal, which Daemon Targaryen had by then taken for the Blacks, and from which he watched Aemond's progress across the landscape with a cold and patient assessment. The shadow of Rook's Rest falls long across the main series, if you know where to look. When Rhaenys Targaryen, a woman whose claim was stronger than the man's who got the throne, who spent her life in the shadow of that fact and never broke, makes her final choice, she is doing what women of great capability in Westeros have always had to do, acting on the terms available rather than the terms deserved. She could not fight the system that denied her. She could make it pay for the denial. That is not justice. It is the closest thing to justice that the world she inhabited could offer. When Daenerys Targaryen loses Viserion to the Night King beyond the Wall, the grief that overtakes her is the same grief that Rhaenyra felt in the Gullet. The same grief that Rhaenys never had time to feel before she died. The death of a dragon is not merely the loss of an animal, however extraordinary. It is the erasure of something irreplaceable, the permanent diminishment of the world's capacity for wonder. There are not enough dragons in the world to afford their losses. There were never enough, really, even when there were 20 of them circling above the Dragonstone. The castle at Rook's Rest remained in green hands after the battle. A minor castle, not strategically decisive in the final accounting. The hillside where Rhaenys and Meleys fell was unmarked by any monument. The Greens had no particular interest in commemorating the sacrifice, and the Blacks who would have did not hold the territory for long enough to do so. The Red Queen dissolved into the landscape of the Crownlands, and time moved on, and the war continued without her. But she is remembered. The histories preserved her in their pages with an unusual warmth that the academically dispassionate prose of Maestercraft rarely produces, as though the people who wrote about her could not quite keep the feeling out of their language when they reached her name. The Queen who never was. The Queen who, in the end, chose to matter more than she chose to live. it is a legacy that does not require a throne. There is another dimension to the Rook's Rest battle that the military histories sometimes overlook in their focus on the tactical outcome. The question of what the engagement cost the Greens in terms of political legitimacy. Aegon I had been the rallying point of the Green cause. The king, crowned and consecrated, however controversial that coronation had been. With him burned and unconscious, the Green War effort was suddenly a war being conducted in the name of an absent king by a 19-year-old prince whose methods were producing significant opposition even among those who had sworn to support Aegon's claim. Aemond was effective. Aemond was also alarming in ways that made certain lords reconsider the precise value of their allegiance. The specific nature of Aemond's campaign across the Riverlands, the pattern of destruction that moved through the farming villages and grain stores of a region that fed a significant portion of the realm, was creating a humanitarian crisis that fell most heavily on the very small folk who had no stake in the succession question and had never been given any say in it. The river lords who maintained positions on both sides of the conflict watched their tenants starve and their fields burn with a combination of outrage and impotence that was building toward something. The something it was building toward would eventually express itself in ways that even Aemond's ruthlessness could not contain. Daemon Targaryen, watching from Harrenhal as the smoke columns rose across the Riverlands, was waiting with the specific patience of a man who understood that you do not need to defeat a force that is in the process of defeating itself. He was also, in this period, doing something that the histories find characteristically difficult to categorize. He was making contact with the group of people who would become known as the Dragon Seeds. The Dragon Seeds were people of common or obscure birth who carried enough Targaryen or Velaryon blood from generations of informal union between the Dragon Lords and the people of the Crownlands and Dragonstone to potentially bond with dragons. This had always been known as a theoretical possibility. What Daemon now proposed was to make it actual, to take the riderless dragons, sea smoke above all, still circling the waters near Driftmark in its extended widowhood, and find them new riders from among the people who might be capable of the bond. It was an extraordinarily bold idea, in a war already full of bold ideas, and its execution would produce some of the most unexpected figures of the entire conflict. The Dragon Seeds who successfully bonded with dragons became briefly some of the most significant military assets available to either side. Their stories are extraordinary in the particular way of the stories of people who arrive from nowhere into the center of great events and change them, before the great events change them in turn. But that is a thread that pulls into the later movements of the war, and we will follow it there. For now, let it simply register that in the shadow of Rook's Rest's tragedy, something new was being created, not by lords or kings or the great houses, but by people whose names the great houses had never bothered to learn. Let that courage settle in you for a moment, quiet and complete. Your breath is slow. The night is still. The hillside at Rook's Rest has been grass, and ordinary Crownland's earth for 2 centuries, no trace remaining of what happened there. The war found its next chapter without the Red Queen, and the next chapter, the one building already in the great stone corridors of King's Landing, would be the strangest one yet. The most shocking thing that happened in the Dance of the Dragons was not a battle between dragons. It was something that happened on the ground, in the streets, done not by knights or soldiers, but by ordinary people who had been living in the shadow of dragons their entire lives, and had finally decided they could not bear it any more. King's Landing fell to Rhaenyra's forces in the 6th month of the year, 130. It fell not through a great military siege, but through a combination of treachery from within, gates opened by guards who had been persuaded, bribed, or simply terrified into switching their loyalty, and the looming visible presence of Daemon Targaryen on Caraxes, circling above the city in slow, deliberate passes that made clear to anyone looking up what the cost of continued resistance would be. Aegon the Sewer had been removed from the capital weeks earlier, carried away to Dragonstone of all places, where Aemon's campaign had left it undefended and therefore available as a convalescent retreat for a king too burnt to fight. Let your breathing be easy now. The city has changed hands. Rhaenyra has entered King's Landing in the manner of a conqueror, which is not quite the manner she would have chosen. The city is half-starved. The war had disrupted the trade routes that fed the capital, and the small folk who lived in the cramped streets below the Red Keep had been eating badly for months, their lives made harder by proximity to a conflict they had not chosen and did not control. They watched the new queen arrive with expressions that were, by the accounts of those who saw them, more exhausted than welcoming. Rhaenyra sat the Iron Throne, after a lifetime of being promised it. After years of watching her father's promise erode, after a war of 2 years that had taken her sons and her dignity and her sense of what the future could look like, she sat in the chair made of swords, in the throne room her ancestor had built, and the moment was hers. The histories that describe it note, with an almost poignant brevity, that the Iron Throne cut her. As it cuts everyone who sits in it, eventually, the iron edges finding new angles with new bodies. She bled a little and did not show it. The city, meanwhile, was struggling. The population of King's Landing was enormous by the standards of the time. Hundreds of thousands of people packed into a space that had not been designed for them. Its original layout, long since overwhelmed by the organic growth of a capital that attracted everyone who had nowhere else to go. These people needed food every day, and the war had made food expensive and sometimes simply unavailable. They needed safety, and the war had made safety a relative concept. And they lived beneath the Dragon Pit on Rhaenys' Hill, the great domed structure where the royal dragons were kept, with the constant awareness that the creatures inside that dome, animals large enough to destroy a city block, with a single exhalation, were nearby. The preacher called the shepherd appeared in this climate like a match struck in a room full of old wood. His identity was never definitively established. His origins were obscure. What he preached was a theology of dragons as abomination, divine punishment made flesh, the gods' retribution visited upon a city that had accepted these unnatural creatures in exchange for the protection they offered, and which was now suffering for the bargain. He had a quality that the very best demagogues always have: the ability to name what people are already feeling before they have found words for it. The fear of the dragons that the small folk of King's Landing had suppressed for a century of Targaryen rule was not gone. It had simply been swallowed, pushed down, accommodated in the daily reality of a city that contained it. The shepherd gave it a name and a direction. The mob that formed around his preaching was not, in most respects, composed of extraordinary people. They were bakers and carters and seamstresses and dockworkers, and the hundreds of other ordinary occupations that make a city function. People whose names are not in the histories, whose individual decisions did not seem significant in the moment of their making, but whose collective action on that particular night, in the year 130, constitutes one of the most significant events in the history of the known world. They marched to the Dragon Pit. Inside the Dragon Pit, at that moment, were several of the royal dragons. Tyraxes, ridden by Rhaenyra's surviving son. Shrykos, a young dragon belonging to the Green faction, left behind when Aegon II was evacuated. Morgul, a small and relatively young dragon. And Dreamfire, Helaena's dragon, the great blue and silver creature who had been increasingly agitated in the months since her rider's death, pacing the confines of the pit in a way that the dragon keepers found ominous. What happened inside the dragon pit that night is recorded in fragments, from the accounts of survivors who escaped and from the physical evidence left behind. The burns, the damage to the dome's interior, the bones that were found in the aftermath. The mob did not simply kill the dragons, they fought them, which meant that many of the mob died too. Died in the fire, died in the claws, died in the simple physics of a very large animal, cornered by very large numbers of very angry people. But the people had numbers, and they had torches and spears and battering rams. And the particular terrible resourcefulness of crowds that have decided that something is going to happen regardless of cost. Helaena Targaryen had died in the weeks preceding the mob's assault on the dragon pit, falling from a window of the Red Keep in circumstances that the histories cannot resolve into certainty. Dreamfire felt it, had been feeling the absence of her rider in the way that dragons feel such things, with a full-body grief that manifested as distraction and agitation. When the mob broke into the dragon pit, Dreamfire was already not entirely herself. She fought with extraordinary ferocity, killing hundreds before she was brought down. And her death, the final death of Helaena's dragon, completed a sequence of losses that had begun with the murder of Helaena's son, and ended here, with the extinction of the bond she had spent her life in. Syrax died in the streets outside the dragon pit. Rhaenyra's own dragon, her companion of more than 2 decades, the she-dragon she had ridden since childhood, killed in the chaos of the night as the mob spread outward from the dragon pit through the surrounding streets. Rhaenyra felt it. Those who were with her in the Red Keep describe a moment, a sudden, violent stillness, followed by a grief that was unlike the grief she had shown for her sons, more physical, more immediate, the grief of losing something that had been part of her body, as much as part of her life. 4 dragons died in the storming of the dragon pit. The dome that had contained them was wrecked, its interior scorched and structurally compromised by the fires that the dying dragons had produced in their final struggles. The city of King's Landing was in chaos, and Rhaenyra, sitting on a throne she had wanted her entire life in a city she had controlled for less than a year, made the decision to flee. This is the moment that the histories treat most gently with her, and perhaps most honestly, the decision to leave. She had lost her sons. She had lost her dragon. She held a city that was rioting against her. The war she had been fighting was not going well in the south, where Tumbleton had recently fallen to Green forces after a catastrophic betrayal by 2 dragons whose riders switched sides. She was alone in the specific way that absolute power can leave a person alone, surrounded by people, and yet without anyone who could tell her the truth about how bad things actually were. She fled to Dragonstone, arriving at the castle that had been her home and her base since the war began, and found it in the hands of her son Aegon the Younger, who had taken it in her absence. And then it was taken from her again, this time by the arrival of the crippled Sunfire, and the half-dead Aegon too, carried back from wherever they had recovered, determined to reclaim the island that had been his family's first home in Westeros. If you are still with us, and still awake enough to wonder, Subscribe so the next chapter is waiting for you when you return. Sleep well. The modern echo of the Dragon Pit rings loudest, perhaps not in any single event of the main series, but in the underlying truth that it demonstrates. That power built on fear produces exactly the reaction you would expect, given enough time and enough desperation. The small folk of King's Landing did not hate the dragons because they were evil. They hated them because they were afraid, and because they had been afraid for a very long time, and because a voice had finally given that fear a shape and a direction. Daenerys Targaryen spent her arc trying to break this cycle, trying to be the kind of ruler whose power did not depend on fear, who was loved rather than merely obeyed. And she failed, in the end, for reasons that are deeply embedded in the structural logic of the world she was trying to change. The shepherd's theology, crude and functional as it was, named something real in the people who received it. The relationship between the small folk of King's Landing and the dragons in their city had always been more complicated than the Targaryen official narrative allowed. The dragons were presented as protectors, symbols of a divine mandate. But the protection they offered was contingent on the priorities of the great houses, directed at enemies the lords designated, not at the endemic small violences of city life that no dragon had ever been deployed to address. The small folk of King's Landing paid the full cost of the Targaryen dragons and received almost none of the benefit. And this accounting had been running in the red for a century of increasingly uncritical dragon veneration that never consulted them on their preferences. The event that paralleled the Dragon Pit, happening in the same terrible season farther south, was the Battle of Tumbleton, where two dragon seeds who had been given dragons by Rhaenyra's faction switched sides, joining the Greens, and used their newly bonded dragons to burn Tumbleton from within. It was a catastrophic betrayal that cost the Blacks a significant military position in the south, and demonstrated that the same innovation, the Dragonseed Riders, that had given the Blacks a temporary advantage could be turned against them with devastating efficiency. The Dragonseeds who betrayed at Tumbleton became known in the histories as the Two Betrayers, and their names, Hugh Hammer and Ulf White, are recorded with a specificity of condemnation that reflects how deeply the betrayal affected the subsequent course of the war. Rhaenyra's position in King's Landing, after the Dragon Pit and before Tumbleton, was already untenable. The Dragon Pit made it impossible. The Dragon Pit burned. The dragons inside it are dust now, their bones recovered after the dance and stored in the crypts of the Red Keep, eventually lost or scattered in the centuries of subsequent history. The dome itself survived, roofless, its great stone walls charred but intact, a landmark of the city that would eventually become a meeting place of a different kind. The wound it represents, the wound of a city that turned on the things that protected it, healed on the surface. Underneath, in the way that wounds of this kind always work, it remained. Let the fires of the Dragon Pit die down now, in the quiet of this late hour. The smoke has settled, the mob has dispersed, the Queen has fled, and the worst of the war, the most personal, the most devastating confrontation, is still to come, above a lake in the center of Westeros, where two men on two dragons have been circling each other across the entire length of the conflict, waiting for the moment when the distance between them becomes impossible to maintain. In the center of Westeros, at the point where the great lake called the God's Eye reflects the sky, two men who had circled each other for the entire length of the war finally found themselves in the same sky at the same moment. What followed was the greatest dragon battle in the history of the world. The God's Eye is the largest lake in the Seven Kingdoms, a body of still water in the heart of the riverlands so vast that on overcast days it is impossible to see the far shore, so deep in its center that the bottom has never been measured, its surface dark and reflective in the way of very deep water that does not simply hold light, but absorbs it. On the Isle of Faces at the lake's center, where the green men keep their ancient vigil among the carved weirwood faces, something older than the Seven Kingdoms watches the sky. On the day of the battle, it would have seen something unprecedented. Let the depth of that lake settle into your imagination. Cold water, very deep, very still. The sky above it reflected with perfect fidelity, so that from above, a dragon would see the water as a second sky, an inverted world of cloud and light moving beneath it. There is a particular quality of stillness that exists above very deep water, as though the weight of what lies below exerts a kind of pressure on the air above it, keeping it quieter than air above solid ground. This is the stillness that Daemon Targaryen flew into on that day, and the stillness that Aemond One-Eye flew into from the other direction, and the stillness that the battle erased for a few very loud minutes before reclaiming it entirely. The circumstances that brought them there were the logic of the war finally becoming inescapable. Aemond had been using Vhagar to burn the Riverlands throughout the preceding months, a campaign of destruction that served the tactical purpose of denying resources to the Blacks, and the psychological purpose of demonstrating what the cost of supporting them would be. He had burned villages and harvests and holdfasts and, at Harrenhal, had found that Daemon Targaryen had already left, departing the great ruined castle before Aemond arrived, which may have been coincidence, or may have been Daemon drawing Aemond toward a confrontation on ground of Daemon's choosing. Daemon Targaryen was old by this point in the war, old by the standards of men who live hard lives in dangerous circumstances, which means he was somewhere in his middle 50s, an age at which most lords of the realm were managing their affairs from chairs by fires, rather than riding dragons into contested airspace. He had been a soldier and a schemer, and an exile, and a prince, and a husband, and a father, and a commander for so long that the specific role he occupied at any given moment had become almost incidental to the central fact of what he was. A man of extraordinary capability who had spent his entire life being too much for the spaces that tried to contain him. He had left Harrenhal before Aemond arrived, and the records suggest he had been composing a song. Not a battle plan, not a letter of instruction, not a logistical document of any kind. A song, the great silver-haired prince in his middle 50s, the most dangerous man the Blacks had on their side, sitting in the burned-out hall of Harrenhal, with a harp he had apparently acquired somewhere along the way, writing a song. The histories note this detail with a puzzlement they cannot quite conceal. It suggests either that Daemon had reached some kind of peace with what was coming, or that he had always been the kind of person who did unexpected things when approaching a moment he knew would be his last. He left Harrenhal on Caraxes. The bloodworm was aging too, not as ancient as Vhagar. Nothing was as ancient as Vhagar, but old enough to be past the peak of the power and speed that had made him remarkable in his prime. He flew north and west toward the God's Eye, and somewhere over the lake. He and Aemond found each other in the sky. What the accounts agree on is the beginning, that the two dragons saw each other, that both riders made the choice to engage rather than disengage, and that what followed was, in the estimation of those who later tried to reconstruct it from the physical evidence on the lakeshore and the testimony of observers at a distance, the most violent aerial combat ever recorded in the history of dragon riding. Caraxes and Vhagar. the bloodworm, and the ancient mountain. One fast and serpentine, and experienced in the particular brutality of close aerial fighting. The other enormous and slow and possessed of raw power that made the outcome seem foreordained to anyone doing the arithmetic. They tore each other apart. That is the simplest and most accurate description of what the physical evidence suggests. The wounds found on both animals, recovered from the lake and the shoreline in the aftermath, indicate a combat of extraordinary mutual destructiveness. Not one dragon killing another cleanly, but two animals locked together in a mutual destruction that cost each of them something it could not survive. Vhagar was the larger. Vhagar was the more powerful. But Caraxes was faster, and Daemon was riding him with a skill and a recklessness that compensated for the disparity in size with the compensation that only acceptance of death can provide. A fighter who has already made his peace with dying is a very different kind of fighter from one who is still trying to survive. They fell together into the god's eye. The lake swallowed them, and the sound of the impact reached the watchers on the shore, and then the lake closed over it all, and was still again, the dark reflective surface resuming its ordinary aspect as though nothing had interrupted it. Aemond One-Eye was found on the northern shore of the God's Eye, with Daemon's sword, Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel blade that had been Daemon's inheritance and his signature weapon throughout his life, buried in the hollow where his eye had once been. Aemond was dead. Whether Daemon placed the sword there before they fell, somehow bridging the gap between dragon and dragon in the chaotic final seconds of the combat, or whether the two men met somehow in those last moments, whether there was a final exchange between uncle and nephew, between the two most dangerous men the war had produced, is something the lake does not give back. Daemon's body was never recovered. The God's Eye is very deep, and whatever settled to its bottom in those minutes on that day has remained there. Some say it is deep enough that the bones will never surface. Caraxes was found on the north shore too, still alive, improbably for a time, missing great portions of his wings, his neck pierced in multiple places. He died on the shore of the lake without his rider, which is perhaps the most dignified ending he could have managed, and which the histories treat with a specificity of detail that suggests those who wrote them found it worth recording that he died looking at the water. The God's Eye received two of the greatest beings of the age in a single afternoon and gave none of them back. The ancient dragon that had lived through the conquest, the red serpent that had been Daemon's other self for 3 decades, the two riders who had been in some sense the true protagonists of the war, all of them in the deep water now, all of them past the reach of any subsequent story. The grief of this loss is not easy to place because the people involved were not simple. Aemond One-Eye had burned the Riverlands with deliberate cruelty. Daemon Targaryen had ordered blood and cheese. They were both people who had done terrible things in the course of this war, as most of the people in this war eventually had. And yet the battle above the God's Eye has been written about across the centuries since it happened, with something that reads unmistakably like mourning, as though the historians who came to it felt that something had ended here, that went beyond the military significance of 2 deaths, that an era had concluded in those few minutes over the lake in a way that eras rarely do, with finality and clarity and a kind of accidental grandeur. When you think of Khal Drogo riding into battle, of all the warrior figures in the main series who defined themselves by their absolute commitment to the fight, whose identity was so bound to the way they lived and the way they faced death that the ending of their stories felt like something larger than a personal loss. You are thinking in the same register that the battle above the God's Eye occupies in the history of the dance. These are not ordinary deaths. They are the deaths of the kind of people who only appear in the world occasionally, whose presence changes the landscape around them, and whose absence changes it back. The lake is still there. The God's Eye still reflects whatever sky is above it, with the same dark fidelity it has always had. The Isle of Faces, where the green men keep their quiet vigil among the carved weirwood faces, is still in the centre of the water. And whatever knowledge the old gods have accumulated about the things that have happened in their sight is still held in the silence of those carved wooden expressions, patient, inscrutable, neither confirming nor denying what the water keeps. The song that Daemon had been composing in the days before the battle was never finished, or if it was finished, no copy survives. The historians who mention it do so in passing, with the puzzlement they cannot quite suppress. A man of Daemon's temperament, at the end of a war of this scale, sitting with a harp. Some have read it as evidence of fatalism, a man who knew what was coming and had made his peace. Others have read it as evidence of exactly the opposite, a man who retained, despite everything, the capacity to want to make something beautiful rather than merely effective. The two readings are not mutually exclusive. Daemon Targaryen was, to the end, a person who contained more than one thing simultaneously. What he left behind, beyond the songs and the stories, was the question of what would have happened if he had survived. The Black Cause died with him at the God's Eye, not immediately, but in the sense that it lost the only person who had consistently held it together, who had the combination of military capability and political intelligence and personal authority to navigate the increasingly fractured state of the Black Alliance. After Daemon, the Blacks were a coalition without a strong centre, and coalitions without strong centres do not win wars of attrition. The God's Eye, in the centuries since, has become the kind of place that people do not talk about directly. The green men on the Isle of Faces do not speak to visitors. The water does not reveal what it holds. The fishermen who work the lake's edges have accumulated across 200 years a substantial body of local knowledge about where not to fish, not because the lake is dangerous in any practical sense, but because there is a diffuse and unspecified understanding that some parts of it are different from others. Heavier somehow, more prone to the specific kind of silence that descends on places where something final happened. Let that stillness find you now. The battle is over. The greatest dragon to ever live in the world fell into a lake in the heart of Westeros, and the prince, who was perhaps the most extraordinary person of his age, went down with her. The war has lost its most formidable actors on both sides, and what remains is not the fire and scale of what came before, but something smaller and darker, and in some ways more terrible. The end of a war between people who have run out of the capacity to win it cleanly, and who will finish it in ways that history has never quite forgiven. The war should have ended when Rhaenyra fled King's Landing. But a war that has consumed everything does not end simply because one side has lost its capital. It ends when there is nothing left to fight over. And they were very nearly there. Rhaenyra Targaryen arrived at Dragonstone in the early days of the year 130. The same black castle above the volcanic sea, where she had been crowned, where she had built her council, where her dragons had sheltered, and her sons had grown into young men before the war took them. She came back to find her son Aegon the Younger in residence, having taken it during her time in King's Landing, and the reunion between a mother who had lost almost everything and a son who had survived things no child should have to survive was, by the accounts that exist, both painful and desperately needed. Your breathing is slow now. Let it remain so. The story we are following is nearing its end. Not yet, but approaching it the way a river approaches the sea, the current quickening almost imperceptibly as it gets closer to the place where the water becomes something larger. What remains of the Dance of the Dragons is not the fire and scale of what came before it, but something quieter and more final. The settling of accounts between two branches of a family that had destroyed most of what they were fighting over. The settlement did not take long in the brutal arithmetic of the thing. Sunfire, Aegon II's golden dragon, the beautiful beast that had been crippled in the battle at Rook's Rest and had spent months recovering in the fields and forests of the Crownlands, had healed enough to fly, though never again with the ease and grace of a healthy dragon. Aegon II, who had also healed, in a similar fashion, functional but diminished, his burns having produced scars that covered much of his body. His eye partially lost to the fire, his temper shortened by months of pain into something that observers found alarming. Boarded his crippled golden dragon and flew to Dragonstone. Rhaenyra was captured. The histories do not linger on the details of the capture itself. It was not, apparently, a dramatic military engagement, but something closer to an inevitability. Dragonstone taken by the forces that arrived with Aegon II before Rhaenyra could organize any effective defense. She had no dragon. Syrax was dead, killed in the streets of King's Landing during the storming of the Dragon Pit. She was a queen without a mount, without a fleet, without an army, with only the dignity she had maintained across 2 years, of a war that had taken everything else she had begun it with. She was brought before Sunfire on the volcanic rock of Dragonstone, on the ground where her family had lived before the conquest, in the shadow of the castle that her ancestors had built. Aegon II did not speak to her, or if he did, no one recorded what was said, because the outcome was already determined, and whatever words were exchanged in those last minutes between two people who had been raised in the same household, who had grown up in the complicated proximity of a blended family full of unspoken resentments, were not words that anyone present was prepared to write down. Sunfire ate her. The golden dragon that had been so beautiful, that had caught the sunlight in ways that made observers stop and stare, consumed the queen who had fought for 20 years to hold the promise her father had made her. It was not a clean death, by any account that survives. It was the kind of death that a war of this kind produces when it reaches its conclusion, necessary from the winning side's perspective and pitiless in its execution. Her youngest son, Aegon the Younger, was present. He was 9 years old. He watched Sunfire eat his mother, and he did not make a sound, and the silence he kept in those minutes and in the days and weeks afterward was the beginning of a silence about dragons that would define the rest of his life and the fate of the last surviving dragons in the world. The historians who write about Aegon III, for that is what he became, Aegon the Dragonbane, the king who presided over the extinction of the dragons, note consistently that the thing that made him unable to care for the remaining animals was not cruelty, but something closer to a deep, permanent inability to be in their presence without reliving the specific memory of what he had seen. Nay, Aegon II's triumph lasted for a very short time. The king who had survived Rook's Rest, and months of recovery, and the loss of most of his family, and the burning of half his body, now sat on an iron throne, in a half-ruined capital with a burned dragon and a ruined realm, and very few supporters who genuinely believed the worst was over. The lords who had supported the Greens throughout the war were, by this point, looking at the accounting of what the conflict had cost them, and finding it did not balance. The lords of the Black faction were still in the field, still capable of resistance, still motivated by the memory of everything that had been done. The end of Aegon II came through the cup rather than the sword, which is the Westerosi way of acknowledging that the people closest to power are often more dangerous than the enemies across the field. He was poisoned. By whom exactly is a matter that the histories circle without quite settling. Corlys Velaryon is the primary suspect in most accounts, and it is true that Corlys had both the access and the motivation. He was old, he was tired, he had watched the war consume his family in the same way it had consumed every family that touched it, and he understood with the clarity of a man who has navigated politics for 60 years that Aegon II's continued survival was going to prolong the conflict indefinitely. Whoever administered the poison, it worked. Aegon II died in the year 131, ending a reign of 2 years, marked by such comprehensive and mutual destruction that the historians who came after it had difficulty finding a framework adequate to what it represented. Not a war between a legitimate king and an illegitimate pretender. Not a war between good and evil, or right and wrong, or the old way and a new one. A war between two branches of the same family, each with a case that could be argued, each with supporters who believed in them, each driving the other to acts of escalating cruelty in a spiral that produced no winner, only survivors, and not many of those. Aegon III was crowned king at the age of 11. He was quiet and pale and did not speak much, and when dragons were brought to his attention, he showed a stillness that his attendants found difficult to interpret as anything other than deep unease. The dragons that remained after the dance were few. Broken things mostly, smaller than the beasts of the previous generation, living in the dragon pit that had been partially repaired after the storming, tended by keepers who were trying to maintain animals that were clearly in decline. The connection between Aegon III's emotional state and the health of the remaining dragons is one of those historical correlations that cannot be definitively proven causal, but that is very difficult to dismiss. A dragon tends to reflect something of the emotional environment in which it is kept, and an environment governed by the silent grief of a boy who had watched his mother eaten was not an environment in which animals might be expected to thrive. One by one, the remaining dragons died, some of illness, some of old age, some of causes that the keepers could not identify or name. The last dragon, a small sickly creature, nothing like the great beasts of the Conquest era, or even the beasts of Viserys I's reign, died in the years of Aegon III's rule, and after it died, there were no more. The most powerful creatures that had ever lived in the world outside the mythologies of the children and the giants were gone, and the Targaryens who had always defined themselves by their relationship to these animals were now simply a dynasty with unusual hair and a collection of dragon skulls in the basement of their throne room. It is worth sitting with that for a very long time. 20 living dragons at the start of the dance. None at the end. Not killed in battle with enemies. Not hunted to extinction by the forces of some other great power. Not lost to plague or disaster beyond anyone's control. Destroyed by a family argument, by the failure of a king to make a hard choice, by the accumulated cruelty of 2 years of war between people who had once eaten dinner together. The echoes of this loss reverberate through every subsequent century of Targaryen history. The later kings tried to hatch new eggs. They failed. They tried to recover breeding pairs from the ruins of old Valyria. They found nothing. The line between the Targaryens with dragons and the Targaryens without them is the dance of the dragons, and everything on the far side of that line is different in kind from everything before it. A diminished inheritance, a dynasty still capable of producing remarkable people, but no longer capable of the thing that had made them unassailable. The specific death of each remaining dragon in the years after the dance carries its own small weight, if you know the names. Vermax had already gone in the gullet, Arax above Storm's End, Tyraxes in the dragon pit, Dreamfire in the dragon pit, Syrax in the streets. Sunfire died not long after Rhaenyra. Whatever injuries it had sustained over the course of the war caught up with it in the months after its rider's death. Caraxes and Vargar in the God's Eye. Sea Smoke at Tumbleton. Of the great dragons of the dance, almost none survived the war itself. Those that lingered into the Regency were younger animals. Smaller, already improperly tended in the chaos of the immediate aftermath, already beginning the slow decline that would end with the last one dying in the early years of Aegon III's personal rule. The dragon keepers who tended the final animals wrote, in documents that were later recovered from the archives of the Citadel, with an unusual degree of personal detail about the creatures in their care. These were professional documents, not sentimental ones, records of feeding and health and behavior, the kind of daily accounting that animal management requires. But the personality of the keepers shows through in the specificity with which they noted the preferences of each dragon, the particular ways different animals responded to the same circumstances, the small individual characters that emerged over time in creatures who were, in the end, going to outlive the world that had produced them by very little. The last keeper's records end mid-sentence. Whether this was because the last dragon died suddenly, or because the keeper died first, or because the records were simply damaged by time, is not known. The final dragon in the world does not have a named death date, only an approximate year. It died without ceremony, without witness, without the world noticing clearly enough to record the moment. The age of dragons ended in a small, practical silence, not in fire and fury, but in the absence of a next breath. When Daenerys Targaryen walked into a fire in Essos and emerged with 3 dragons, the world, the people in that world, the histories of that world, the understanding that the main series encodes, recognized something astonishing, not because dragons were unimaginable, but because they had been lost, specifically, in a specific act of destruction, and the loss had been so complete and so long that their return was genuinely miraculous. The miracle had a context. The context was the dance. And the dance was the consequence of a king who built small clay models of old Valyria and could not bring himself to choose between the daughter he loved and the sons custom demanded he prefer. 2 years. It lasted 2 years. And in those 2 years, the world of ice and fire lost something it would not recover for more than a century and a half. The fire went out. The age of dragons ended. We have followed the dance of the dragons from the bedside of a dying king to the volcanic shore where his daughter died. We have moved through the conspiracy of a single night, through the grief of assassinations and naval battles, and the burning of cities, through the greatest aerial combat in the history of the world, to the quiet and terrible end. A boy of 11 sitting on a throne in a damaged city, looking at the skull of the last dragon in the world, being told that there were no more. You have been here through all of it, breathing steadily in the dark, and you deserve a moment now to simply rest in the fullness of what it meant. The rain comes slowly here. Let it come. Feel it settle over the story the way rain settles over old ground, not washing it away, but soaking in, becoming part of the earth, joining all of the other water that has ever fallen in this place. The Dance of the Dragons is over, in the sense that the specific events have concluded. But nothing that happened in those 2 years is really over, in the sense of having stopped producing consequences. It is still producing them. It will produce them for as long as the story of Westeros continues. The most immediate consequence was the one no one had prepared for, because no one had genuinely believed it was possible. The dragons were gone. Not reduced, not diminished to a few survivors, not present in some attenuated form. Gone. The institution of dragon riding, the central defining activity of Targaryen supremacy, had been erased by the Targaryens themselves in the course of a single war. This was not the loss of a weapon. It was the loss of an identity. The Targaryens had always been the Dragon Lords. They were now just lords. Aegon III. Targaryen, called the Dragonbane, though he would have found the name unjust, he had not killed the dragons. He had simply been unable to save them, which is a different kind of failure, but perhaps an equally defining one. Ruled for 36 years after the dance. He was, by most accounts, a competent and sometimes even wise king. He kept the peace. He rebuilt what the war had damaged, or at least oversaw its rebuilding, which is the thing kings actually do rather than doing it themselves. He married twice, produced heirs, maintained the institutions of the realm with reasonable competence. He was also, for 36 years, visibly haunted. The people who wrote about him noted it without quite naming it, a quality of absence in certain moments, a tendency to stillness at times when stillness was not called for. An inability to be in the dragon pit even after the remaining dragons had died. And it was just a building. An empty domed structure on a hill with scorch marks on its walls. He had watched his mother eaten. He carried that image through 3.5 decades of kingship, and it shaped him in ways he could not fully prevent even when he was aware of them. The regency that preceded his formal assumption of power was contested and complicated, as regencies always are in Westeros. The great lords who had survived the dance jockeying for position around a child king. The fractures of the war not quite healed. The lords who had been on the losing side of the succession still present and still capable of making things difficult. Corlys Velaryon, old and tired and more weary than he had ever been in a life that had never been restful, served for a time. He outlasted most of the people he had known. The sea snake had seen the beginning of the dance, and he saw the beginning of what came after it. And he died, finally, in old age, having watched everything he had built become something smaller than what it had been. The long aftermath of the dance produced, in the generations that followed, a Targaryen dynasty fundamentally different from the one that had existed before it. Without dragons, the family was powerful. They held the Iron Throne. They commanded the loyalty of the great lords. They had the accumulated authority of 100 years of Targaryen rule to draw on. But they were not unassailable. For the first time, the great lords who bent the knee did so because of tradition and inertia, rather than because of the visible, undeniable, hovering proof of what would happen to them if they did not. The difference between those two kinds of power is enormous, and Westeros felt it across the following centuries in the form of rebellions and succession crises, and instances of great lord overreach that would not have been conceivable in the reign of Viserys I. The dragon skulls remained in the Red Keep, lining the walls of the throne room, great black fossils of the age that had preceded the current one, arranged in order of size from the smallest to the enormous remains of Velaryon the Black Dread, who had died of old age years before the dance, and whose skull was so large that a man could stand upright inside his eye socket. They were there throughout the Targaryen dynasty's subsequent history, through every reign and every conflict, until Robert Baratheon took the throne after the death of Aerys II, the Mad King, and had the skulls moved to the dungeons, because he did not want to do his daily business in a room that reminded everyone of the thing his family had displaced. This is the detail that connects the ancient past we have been moving through to the world you already know. Those skulls in the dungeons. When Daenerys Targaryen began to reclaim her family's history, when she educated herself about what her ancestors had been and what they had done and what had been done to them, the skulls were the physical text she was reading. The bones of Velaryon, the bones of Vhagar, the bones of Syrax somewhere in that underground inventory, wherever they had been placed after the Dragon Pit and the streets of King's Landing and the long passage of years. She was reading the dance of the dragons in those bones without knowing it fully. She was reading the story of Rhaenyra, her ancestress, whose claim had been exactly as contested as Daenerys' own. She was reading the story of a woman who had a dragon and a right and a promise from her father, and still could not hold what she had been given, because the institutions of the world she inhabited were not built to accommodate what she was. She was reading it and drawing from it the lesson she needed, which was not the lesson that history would have recommended, had history been in a position to offer advice. Jon Snow knew nothing, as he himself would have been the first to acknowledge when he came to understand his true parentage. He knew nothing of the succession crisis that had preceded Rhaenyra by 2 decades, when the Great Council had ruled against female succession. He knew nothing of the dance, the specific proof that the question his own parentage raised was not a new question, but an ancient and catastrophically dangerous one. He knew nothing of how the last time 2 Targaryens had competing claims to the same throne, the world had lost all its dragons and tens of thousands of people, and the shape of the future had been altered in ways that were still being felt 2 centuries later. He would not have wanted the throne even with full knowledge of all of this. That is perhaps the most poignant thing about Jon Snow. A man with a genuine claim that he genuinely did not want, surrounded by people who wanted him to have it for their own reasons, in a world where refusing a legitimate claim is not a simple matter of personal preference, but a political act with consequences of its own. He was, in this sense, the opposite of every protagonist in the dance. A person who had been given something he did not ask for, and was trying to give it back, in a world that did not have a mechanism for that kind of return. The Iron Throne itself is perhaps the truest inheritance of the dance. Not the physical object that has been replaced, repaired, modified across the centuries, but the idea of it, the contested, uncomfortable, ultimately unanswerable question of who has the right to sit in a chair made of swords. Every succession crisis in the history of Westeros after the dance carries the DNA of the dance. The failure to establish clear succession principles, the reliance on force rather than law, the willingness of the great lords to treat the throne as a prize to be captured rather than an institution to be maintained. Robert Baratheon sat on it because he swung a hammer well, and the Mad King was mad. Joffrey Baratheon sat on it because his mother was ruthless and his grandfather was patient. Tommen Baratheon sat on it until a more ruthless power removed him. The dance had demonstrated definitively that the throne rewarded none of the things a wise ruler would want it to reward, and every subsequent ruler proceeded on the assumption that this lesson did not apply to their particular situation. What happened to Westeros after the dance really happened in the long sweep of the following 2 centuries before the main series begins was a slow diminishment of grandeur. Not a collapse, not a fall, but a settling. The world becoming smaller, less extraordinary, less visible against the sky. The Targaryens remained, the great houses remained, the seasons remained, still too long, still too cold, still carrying in their length the evidence of something wrong at the heart of the world's climate that would eventually produce the long night that Viserys and the Targaryens had always feared and prepared for. But the dragons were gone, and with them the particular quality of a world that contained the impossible. The ordinary continued. The ordinary is both more comfortable and less beautiful than the alternative, and the world after the dance was very much more ordinary than the world before. If you are still with us, and still awake enough to wonder, thank you for following this story to its end. Subscribe so the next journey is waiting when you return. Sleep well. You have travelled far tonight. You have moved through 12,000 years of history and 2 years of war that changed everything. You have followed a king who loved peace into the catastrophe that his love of peace produced. You have sat with the grief of a mother losing her children one by one. You have watched the greatest creatures in the world die, not to an enemy they could not fight, but to a family that forgot what it was for. You have heard the god's eye close over the last of an age, and you have traced the long, slow echo of all of it down through the centuries to the characters you know, to Ned Stark's loyalty, and Jon Snow's impossible birthright, and Daenerys Targaryen's return of the dragons, and the question, never fully answered, of who has the right to determine the shape of the future. There is no clean ending to any of this. That is the honest thing to say about the Dance of the Dragons, and about the history of Westeros more broadly. It does not resolve. It does not settle into the kind of conclusion that allows everyone involved to understand what it meant and go home. It continues, each generation inheriting the consequences of the last one's choices, each new crisis fed by the unresolved questions of the crisis before it. The wheel spins, as someone once said, but you have done something tonight that matters, even if it does not solve anything. You have sat with the complexity rather than hurrying past it. You have felt the weight of Rhaenyra's losses, the cold calculation of the Green Council, the particular tragedy of beautiful Sunfire eating a queen. You have let the god's eye be as deep as it actually is. You have followed the dance all the way to the boy king sitting in a damaged city, looking at a world without dragons. And you have understood, as fully as understanding is possible from this distance, what was lost. That is not nothing. In a world that moves very fast and asks very little of its readers in the way of sitting with complexity, choosing to spend a night with 2,000 years of this particular history is a choice that the story itself, if it could want things, would want you to have made. The stories will be here tomorrow. The history will keep. The dragons are somewhere in their absence, which is not the same as not being anywhere at all. And now, traveller, now your watch is ended. Let your breath go slow. Let the images of the story dissolve the way images do at the edge of sleep. becoming less specific, more like light and temperature than like narrative. Let the long ago of it recede. Let the present come back gently, in the form of the weight of the bed, the temperature of the air, the ordinary beautiful darkness of a room where nothing is required of you. If you liked this journey, let me know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. I am always curious about that. And if you have a story you would like us to follow next, leave it in the comments. The Maester is listening, and there are many more long nights ahead. Sleep well.